How free is Africa from the caprices of Western economic system? Today, our focus will be on the role IMF is playing in African economy. We'll talk about Nigeria, we'll talk about Kenya. Now, this is important considering the fact that some leaders in Africa have become agents of the wealth using the instrumentality of IMF and the World Bank. So the question we want to ask ourselves here is, why is the IMF and the World Bank so much interested in African economy? Is it geopolitics? Is it because they do not want Africans, the African country, the African continent, or the countries seen as successful in Africa to grow? Because some of the conditionalities for some of the huge loans they give out to these African countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and the likes of them, some of the conditionalities is increasing tax, removing subsidy. Now let's look at Nigeria as an example. Now the IMF is putting so much pressure on the current administration to increase tax on all fronts. Yeah, but they forget the fact that Nigeria is currently the poverty capital of the world. The number of poor persons in Nigeria supersedes or is more than what you have in India, with close to 1 billion people in population. Now, the subsidy has been removed on petroleum products. Now, the IMF did not even talk about putting in place palliatives to cushion the effect. Now, the suffering, the inflation is more over 33%, food inflation close to 40%. The people cannot even afford the minimum staple diet in Nigeria without electricity, without palliatives. Now there's removal of subsidy in petroleum products, on electricity. The people are really suffering. Now the government of Africa, the same thing is happening in Kenya, and then this has led to so much chaos and protest that's happening in Kenya. And Nigeria is warming up to a protest sometime in August. Now all of these are caused by the imposition of conditionalities on African leaders by IMF and the World Bank. Now, this is because Africa got independence over 60 years ago from the West, but they still do everything possible to, in quote, legitimize their government by getting approval from the West, who are not even voters in these countries. Now, let's look at why is the IMF so much interested in Africa, but they're not talking about the exploitation, child labor going on in DR Congo. They are not talking about what is happening in Cameroon. They're not talking about the corruption going on in Africa. Because some of the funds that have been laundered from Africa to the West, if there's no collaboration between the West, that will not happen. The IMF is not talking about that. The IMF is not talking about the poverty in Nigeria. The IMF is not talking about the collaboration of the West, the oil bunkering that happens in the Niger Delta part of Nigeria. The IMF is not talking about that. So that means it's possible to say that the IMF is more interested in something else than ensuring that these countries which they impose huge conditionalities develop. Now let's look at some signs, of Western dominance, because whether we like it or not, the West still dominates. Even for the Francophone countries, the Anglophone countries in Africa, the West still dominates. Let's look at some signs of Western dominance in Africa. Now, before every election, you find that aspirants, fall over themselves to go to Chatham House, go to Washington, D.C., go to Elysee Palace in France. Why? The voters are not there. The allegiance is to the people in Africa. Why do you go there? Now, this talks about one of the signs of Western dominance in Africa. Now, this visit of an African leader to some of the superpower, 10 Downing Street, White House, Elysee Palace, is seen as political achievement. Africa is meant to be independent. And then we talk about why is America having a percentage share in the African Development Bank. That means about 26% or 23 or 26% of American share is with the African Development Bank. That means at some point, the Americans will have to determine who becomes president of the African Development Bank. You don't see that happening in the European banks. Why would Americans have share in the African Development Bank? Over time, we've seen they've been representative of the US in the EU, in the African Union Parliament, in the African Union. Why is that? This shows still dominance of the West in Africa. And then we have in Britain, in the US, in France, in these superpower countries, we still have Office of African Affairs. They still have like a ministry or an office that deals with African affairs. Africa is meant to be a continent made up of independent countries. Why would you treat Africa like more or less a project or more or less a department that you have someone to deal with? And then we've seen in recent times Europe, African bilateral relations and all of that. All of these are meant to keep Africa within the caprices of the Western economic system, which is not beneficial to the common man on the street in Africa. So when will Africa be free? And why is the IMF so much interested in Africa, in countries with so much resources? Well, I would like to hear your comments on this, and just say if IMF or World Bank have overbearing influence on our economy or on our system. And please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And don't forget also to follow me on my WhatsApp channel that is displayed on the screen. And please like and share so others can make contributions to this video. And until I come your way again, I remain Joel.